Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So we start the final verse, Pauri 38, within the Japji Sahib composition. And we've been through the 5 stages of spiritual development, the 5 states that Guru Nanak has talked about on the path, on the journey. But what do you do when you've learnt all the stages of spiritual growth? As you, the listener, come to the end of this particular commentary on the Japji Sahib, where will you go from here? You start on the path of that Dharam Khand with hope, with optimism. But as you see the sheer scale of the journey that Guru Nanak has outlined with Dharam Khand, with Karam Khand, and then finally with Sach Khand, then when you realize the scale of that journey ahead of you, it can be a little bit daunting. It can leave you a little bit despondent. How do you deal with the knowledge that you don't exist, but with the experience that you live within the ego every day? What do you do? So in this final verse, Guru Nanak Dev Ji talks directly to you, the ego, the self, and talks to you and your role on this journey. In the 5 stages of the spiritual journey, the last stage in which the ego existed was Saram Khand. That stage where you have to get up and do something, the effort. That state of endeavour. So Guruji now goes back to that state to clarify what exactly do you need to do. What role do you, the ego, have to perform? Knowledge is never going to be enough. There is effort that still needs to be performed. Now, even in Saram Khand, we identified that efforts have already been talked about throughout Japji Sahib, starting with this idea of Amrit Vela, and then Guruji goes in detail in the 4 verses that end with Ades Dise Ades, the verses 28 to 31, where Guruji identifies lots of different endeavours. And remember, that verse started with Munda Santok Saram Patjoli, with having contentment, disciplines. Guruji describes all of these qualities of living a saintly life: self-restraint, trust, universal brotherhood, compassion, oneness. So those verses talked about what the qualities are of just living a saintly, godly life. Here, in this final verse, Guru Nanak Dev Ji specifically talks about what efforts you need to do to progress on this journey. And how do you build up and how do you build upon those efforts, like compassion, like trust? How do you build on those? And Guruji specifically said that the effort was to do something to transform the mind. With your gyan, with the wisdom, the effort is to change, transform, to revitalize our own thinking. And in Saram Khand, Guruji says, Tithe kadiye surt mat man buddh. So here, awareness, identity, and intelligence within the mind get shaped and formed. So the key to discarding the ego lies in reforming our minds. The question is, how can it be done? What are the steps that we need to take? What's the tools that we have at our disposal? What's the right environment? What are the circumstances that we need to undergo this transformation? So let's take an example. Imagine that you were going to renovate an old classic car. Imagine that you're going to transform an old classic car that you've bought. Assuming that you've done your research, assuming that you have all the skills that you need to start the project, the first thing that you might do is to set up a workshop, set up a space to actually do the work, to do the effort. Perhaps you might clear your garage to make that space, and then you need to make sure that you have all the tools, the time and the skills so that you can get the job done. And Guru Nanak Dev Ji uses a similar example here. Guruji uses the example of a workshop of a goldsmith where he's taking raw gold and minting them into precious coins. So Guru starts by saying, Jat Pahara Tiraj Sunyar. So the word Jat is restraint, self-restraint, self-control. And if Jat is self-restraint, then somebody who practices that control is known as a Jati. In the Sodar Pauri of Japji Sahib, number 27, we heard the line, Gavan Jati Sati Santokhi. So the songs being sung at the door of the divine are being sung by the Jati, the self-controlled, the charitable, and the Santokhi, the contented ones. So that's the meaning of Jat. Self-control, self-restraint. Pahara means specifically the workshop of a metallurgist, somebody who works with metals. And generally there are a few types of metallurgists. We talk about those who work with precious metals. They're known as Sunyar, being gold workers, and Luhar being the ones who work with steel and iron. So specifically we're talking about the workshop is the environment that Guruji first starts talking about, and the environment of a Sunyar. Guruji starts by saying, Jat Pahara. Establish a workshop of self-control. So if we want to reform the mind, the environment within which the mind can be transformed is an environment of self-control and restraint. So this work is never going to be carried out in the Gurdwara, in the church, in the temple, in the mosque. Because the transformation of the mind is happening within you, then that environment within which it has to happen is also within you. You have to make yourself into a workshop of self-control, of restriction. So within yourself, create the environment of self-discipline and restraint. And Jat specifically means controlling your senses, your 5 senses. In the Indian tradition, 5 Gyan Indriya are the 5 senses that we also know in English, which is sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. And these are the senses with which you have an understanding of the world around you. But your 5 Karam Indriya are the ones that allow you to do actions. So those are 2 arms, 2 legs, and a tongue. But we also have this idea of Panj Vikar, 5 vices, which are your Kaam, your lust, Krodh, your anger, Lobh, your greed. Moh, your attachment. And hankar, your pride, your self-importance. So jat is a control of all of these things. Typically, in the Indian tradition, it was seen as pious and saintly to become what is known as brahmacharya, which is a celibate. And even today, within the Sikh tradition, you will have saints who are titled as Bihangam, never get married, celibate. What Guru Nanak Dev Ji is talking about isn't about celibacy, because the Gurus themselves practiced Grist Jivan. The Gurus themselves were married. The Gurus themselves had children. So here Jat isn't talking about becoming a renunciate. This is something that is applicable to the family person. To you in your normal everyday life, how do you control your senses? So the primary instruction here is to control your senses, to control your vices. Now, if we think about our spiritual journeys, sometimes we can feel a little bit lost. We can wonder why, when we're performing our rituals, when we're doing our spiritual rules and regulations, when we're following all those things, why it isn't working, why aren't we progressing? What is the obstacle? What's the barrier? What's the thing that isn't working? The obstacle always has been the mind. That's always been our obstacle. So of course the mind is the pride and glory of the human being. But what your mind is doing is it's also stopping you from realizing your connection with this oneness. So why has that happened? The reason it's happened is because within your mind, you've fallen in love with the world around you. You've fallen in love with your body. And the mind has fallen in love with itself. So we've created an attachment to the world and to our body-mind identity. We can call that Maya. We can summarize all of that as being Maya. The mind has fallen in love with it. And by doing so, it's made you forget who you are. And because we love our identity, because we've fallen in love with our body, because we've fallen in love with our mind, we now do whatever we can to sustain that identity. We now feed that identity. What we do is we spend as much time as possible running after happiness. And the way we run after happiness is by indulging in all the pleasures that the world has to offer the body and all the pleasures that the mind can take. That's what we spend all of our time doing. That's how we define happiness. And so while these pleasures are there, what we've done is we've engaged in our panch vikar. We've engaged in our lust, in our anger, in our greed, in our attachments, and in our self-pride, because ultimately these are pleasurable. As much as we may learn that these things are somehow vices, somehow they're negative, our experience of them is ultimately that they serve us. They give us some pleasure, some joy. Even anger makes us feel right, makes us feel superior. Even greed makes us feel self-worthy. We've created a cycle. The cycle is that we love our identity and then we feed our identity with pleasures. And the more that we enjoy those pleasures, the more it feeds our identity. The more we self-identify with the body and we identify with the mind. This is a cycle that now needs to be broken. The pleasure of the senses has created our sense of separation. And the Guru wants to reconnect you. The Guru wants to make you whole again. the most important question is, do you want that for yourself? Have you had enough of your own indulgences? Has the time arrived for you to transcend the temporary body, the temporary pleasures? Remember that these pleasures have always been temporary. Nothing that you've engaged in has given you everlasting happiness. But because it runs out, we feel like we are validated in running after it again. The question is, are you ready to end that cycle?